Well, again, good morning, and it's a blessing to be with you as always. So again, hope that what we offer this morning will be a blessing and will challenge you all at the same time. That's always the goal of every message is to leave us better than we were when we got here. Hopefully that's always the goal, is to get us to look at something from a different perspective, not because the speaker is right, but rather that it causes us to look at something we haven't paid attention to before. Because how easy is it? Let's just be serious and transparent for a moment. How easy is it to just read something one time or hear something one time and then that's it? And we don't look anything beyond that. We don't really look at what's actually being said. It's almost like hearing a song and not really listening to the lyrics. That's how we get the wrong interpretation sometimes of the lyrics. We're singing along the whole time, and then one day we look up the lyrics and it's like, well, that's not what it says, or oh, that's what it says. I mean, it could go both ways, And sometimes it's funny to look back at all what you thought it said and then go back and like, oh, I've been singing it wrong for 40 years. But we've talked about foundations a lot over the years that we've been together. And a lot of times what we've looked at is the importance to understand the importance of the materials that things are built on. Whether they are worthy, whether they're strong, whether they're weak, all those different things. Do we trust in that material? And the fact that it all matters. Why does it matter? And the question is, does it truly hold up under a test? Because foundations will prove that test one way or the other, whether it's strong or whether it's not. We see the image there, which I think is very, very strong. And we look at that. And so we turn, as we always do, to a familiar text. And sometimes you've probably noticed the pattern of the way that I teach, but I always go back to the familiar, because it often never says what we think it does. Or there's something so much deeper there, so much more profound there than just the surface. So I want us to see the actual message that is in this text. And it is not about building a house, but rather it is about building life. And this is so important as we look at the days ahead. What do they hold for any of us? We're not talking about crystal ball, future predictions. We're not talking about any of that kind of stuff. We're talking about how do we project things that we believe? How do we build on those? Because Jesus here is teaching a lesson. And this is very, very important that we look at Jesus in this particular light. I want us to just reduce everything else down to one thing. Jesus in this particular light is the teacher. That's it. We're not seeing anything else. There's a reason that I say that, and I'll bring that out in the message. So here he says, therefore. Now we've talked about that word a lot, and again, it's a simplistic word that we use. It's part of our Western culture, part of our language. We use it all the time, but it always has a deeper meaning. And my family in particular, my kids, my wife, everybody, when they hear Dad say therefore, there's always a message after. Not just because I happen to be the preacher, but they're like, oh, geez, here it comes. So it's a result of something that has already been said or something that has already been done. So here Jesus says, therefore. So again, pointing us to something else. In this particular case, something that I've already said or something that I've already done. And this is the results that it should have. So that's where the placement of this therefore is so important. So he's therefore, everyone who hears. Now, why is that important? We see the word everyone here. So the application is broad. It's not just a specific group. He said everybody that hears. So the intended audience here is pointing to everybody who has heard. Not just those that are nearby, but rather all who have paid attention in the entirety of the area that covers the therefore. All right, so we go back to the broad spectrum. He says, everyone who has heard these words of mine. Now that's important. Why? Well, let's look at what it says here. What preceded that therefore? We have to find something important here. We touched on this a little bit last week in a very similar statement as Jesus was teaching last week. And he said, these words I have spoken to you. We talked about that at depth last week. Now, how do we match these two up? Well, let's look. They're similar in tone. They're similar in context. But we have to understand in this particular message the personal nature of what is being said. Everybody who hears these words of mine. that poses a question out of a statement. All right, so we have everyone who hears these words of mine. Well, that makes a question rather than a statement. What is the question? What did I say? What did I say? Every good teacher is trying to give a lesson, and if the return of that from the student is actually having listened to what was said, right? So what did I say? What were the words of mine? That's not a broad statement, okay? This is not just a general question, but rather it is very specific. He didn't say, whoever hears the law. He didn't say whoever hears the prophets. He didn't even say whoever hears the scripture, because all of those can be heard and not understood. Can we agree with that? All of those can be heard and certainly not applied, because some people aren't going to. Others don't know what it's talking about. But he says something here that is personal. And that's because not everything is always taken personal. And when we do, we read something is different when it's personal. In other words, when I'm talking specifically to the group, but if I single out Jeff, all right, which I always do, or I single out whoever, okay, that's personal. I'm talking to that person. Now, generally we wouldn't do that in a setting such as this, but in a personal conversation, in a room or walking down the road, if I'm talking to that. So here Jesus is speaking in a very personal nature, which that creates a challenge, because it asks the question, am I listening? Does it matter what they're saying? Do I care what they're saying? So that requires that I'm not just studying. That does not require that I'm just reading, but it requires that I make a commitment to look internally, because this is about me. Am I getting what is being said, and does it matter? Does it make a difference? He says, whoever, everybody, everyone who hears these words of mine. And then we find the word and. And. So there's something additional to this, the hearing. He says, and acts on them. Wow. Hold on a minute. So yes, there is a part that we play. We talked about that last week. You know, when he said, if you heard these words of mine, and like, well, but that's hard. This is hard. How do we? This is what he's trying to get us to see here. It's the same exact thing. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them, he says, will be like a wise man. Well, what is wisdom? Wisdom is the application of knowledge. So what I've heard, I've done something with. That's the challenge of every lesson that we have. So here again, he said, will be like a wise one who properly applies the knowledge, who built his house on the rock. Now, we see the image here, right? That's an imagery thing. We can see that, a house on a big, bold foundation, a rock, if you will, a mountainside. Man, that's solid, that's strong. But what we see here is an image. What we see here is an illustration that hearing and paying attention and applying and structure and solid foundation, all of that's here within just those first sentences, right? Everyone who hears these words of mine will be like a wise man that I count as a wise man who has built their house on a rock. But there's still a question here. There's still a question here that is the true purpose of the lesson that is being taught, because this is not just illustrative for the sake of being illustrative. This, again, is not about construction and architecture or any of that. No, this is about life. What are the words that Jesus is speaking of? He says, everyone who has heard these words of mine. Well, how important is it to know what those words are? It takes a little time to figure that out. And so we just don't see, again, a construction lesson here, because we know the logics of that, right? And we don't have to have an engineering degree to know that if you build a house on sand or a house on a foundation, the two are going to act differently when a storm comes. All right, that's not hard to believe. I grew up near the beach. Hurricanes came, and I've seen them going right down inlets when they got washed right off, because they didn't have anything under them. I've seen that, because that's real. That's not what we're talking about here. It's important to know what words he was speaking of, because we're not talking about memorizing Scripture. And again, I'm not negating that. Don't get me wrong, but that's not what he's talking about. This is deeper, all right, because this is personal. Think about what he says. Everyone who hears and acts. Very important. Very important. So he's saying, when life happens, and it will, everybody here has got a story. Some of us are in the midst of that story. Some of us have come through it. And some of us are getting ready for the next one. All right? When life happens, and it will, what that life has been built on will make the difference. What that life has been built on will cause it to stand or fall. And he says, I've been giving you the building blocks all along the way. Have you been listening? Have you been paying attention to what's been going on? Because if you've been paying attention, it'll make a difference. In other words, it's not about how much you know. It's not about how much you memorize. It's not about how often you show up. It's not about your title. It's not about your position or even your affiliation. No, it's about, have you built your life? Have you built your life? Not the house. Have you built the life that we use and that we have? Have you built that life to shelter that life? Have you built that life to survive what comes and what may be coming? Because the words that he spoke were always about living. If we understand the teachings of Christ, and I think this is important, I've centralized the later stages of my ministry, whatever that looks like. I've centralized that around and focusing on the teachings of Christ because I'm finding there's something pivotal there about understanding this thing we call life. Because it's personal. He's always talking to the heart. And here, this is not about pointing fingers. This is not about looking for our faults or looking for faults in others, because that's easy. That's low-hanging fruit. You know, we can look at someone and say, oh, well, you know, they look this way or that way, or they act this way or that way. That's easy stuff. What's going on in here? This is what he's trying to get us to focus on. So what were his words? What were the words that he's speaking of? Whoever hears these words of mine. There's a specificity there. That's my big word for the day. I got it out and I didn't come well enough. Huh? But here we see, he quickly points not to book and verse. He doesn't do that, right? No, he points to the lesson. See, Jesus always talked about humility. Always. Every lesson always pointed to that. He says, oftentimes, as we can look through a synopsis of all the different things that he taught, what did he teach? Blessed are the poor in spirit. He always spoke against hate. What did he say? He said, love your enemy. Whoa. He spoke against the trap and the bondage of resentment. He taught forgiveness. The total opposite of that. He spoke about true character and why that matters. Who are you? Not who you pretend to be. Who are you? That's real. He said that matters more than notoriety. That matters more than high pedestals. Because the pedestal is fine and the view is good, but that fall is a booger. You got to be careful with that. And that's what he talked about humility. He spoke about prayer. He's talking about the personal nature of that conversation rather than a public performance. He would tell them, don't pray like the Pharisees. They just looking to be heard. They like the attention. They want it. He said, don't do that. It's a conversation between you and the Creator. Here he spoke against worry. He said, whose life has that ever helped? Again, I've made it reference before. We have statements in our Western culture, in our general speech. I'm worried what? To death. That's not a good thing. That's not a good solution, right? And so we see him, and these are the words that he spoke. He spoke against worry. It doesn't help anybody. He pointed out that judging actually starts in the mirror. Take the plank out of your eye before we worried about the splinter in somebody else's. We struggle with that one. Okay, that's because the other is so much easier to see. I don't want to see mine. I don't like looking for the flaws in my mirror because there's a whole bunch of them. I don't want to see. I'd rather see them in somebody else. That's the conditioning of our culture, but Jesus didn't teach that. He made it clear that asking and seeking and knocking, which we talked about a few weeks ago, that's okay. He said that's completely okay. He talked about the benefit of that. In fact, that's how we learn. That's how we find the answers. He made it clear that helping others and treating others as you want to be treated is not just a golden rule. These are words to live by. This changes things. This is structurally changing how we build the foundation of life. He is saying in our text, he said, everyone who hears and acts on these words of mine is wise, like one building a house on a rock. The value, I would say this morning, the value of knowing these words is priceless. Because it gives us something to hold on to. It gives us something to truly, just tangibly hold in our hands and look at and say, are these things there? Are these part of my structural makeup? The value of this is priceless because life happens. How do we understand that? How is that found in this illustration? Well, let's look forward. He said, the rains come, the rivers rise, the winds blow, and when they blow, they pounded that house. Now, I want to ask you something this morning. How often does that describe one of our days, one of our weeks, maybe one of our years? We've all been there to where, is this storm ever going to pass? Is this storm ever going to stop? Because the wind doesn't quit. The rain keeps pouring. And the only thing that's growing is the weeds and not the grass. We get caught into that place. We get struggled and trapped into that place. It's a lot of stuff that we have to think about. This is what he's trying to get us to see in this passage. And he's pointing out, and he's saying that the strength of the house to withstand all of that is found in the foundation. That's where it all stops. It all stops and starts right there in the foundation. And he's saying that foundation needs to be solid. It needs to be dependable. It needs clarity. In other words, there's no question. Okay? If you're a builder, if you've ever built anything, you don't build the house on a 2x4, right, Andrew? You don't do that. It don't last, right? You know? And once that weight starts getting on it, it starts bowing down. It doesn't work very good. You know? Back in my days of wrestling, the structure that we would get in that we call the ring, the way that was built mattered, okay? Because we got a couple of 200-pound guys in there, 250-pound guys in there, you could have a pretty solid stage. You get two 400-pound guys in there, it needed a little bit more sturdiness. You get Andre the Giant in there, that's a whole different story, right? You got to have a real foundation of this, so because not, it'll come down. We were working a show one night, and a guy gave me what they call a back suplex. I'm up in the air and falling down 8 foot down the ground, and the thing broke. And we went right down to the ground because the manufacturer of that particular ring didn't do a very good job. So the foundation, and it hurt a lot on that fake wrestling. It really did hurt. But I was at the doctor years ago, and they were doing x-rays. And he said, what did you do? And I'm like, well, we won't talk about that. But here, he's saying about your life, this matters. And what we do, and he's saying that the things that we build on are found in the words that he gave to hear. But if they go no further than hearing, that's all they do. He said the one who hears and acts upon them, that is the one that he counts as wise. Because what he's saying there is because in spite of the rain and the rivers rising and the wind, while they come, and they do come, he said, in spite of that, the house didn't collapse. It didn't collapse. It will hold steady. Now, that absolutely does not mean that there's no damage. Because there are times the boards do come off. There are times that some shingles are going to get blown off. But what he says here is it did not collapse because it had a foundation on the rock. And the rock is, he said, the words that I have given you to hear and act upon. That changes how we look at this particular, not just illustration in this passage, but how we look at life. What am I building my life on? Am I building it on the latest trend? Am I building it on the latest fad? Am I building it on the latest political move or the most popular sports figure? Anything. What am I building my life on? Is there any structure there? Is there anything that is worthwhile? Or does it pass? And then when that wind comes and that rain comes, well, we got to start all over again. That's what he's saying. Be careful about what we're building on. And so this is not merely talking about a belief or even a belief system, because many people carry titles. I'm a Christian, I'm a this, I'm a that, or whatever the case. But here he says, don't just hear the words, act on them. Act on them. And there's a difference, because a lot of people can know the words and not put them in action, right? You know, because that's just the way. And knowing and stating a belief and acting on the words, well, they're not the same. They're not the same. And Jesus here is talking about how one lives out the words versus just knowing the words. A lot of people know the words. It's like knowing the words to a song and you can't sing. All right? Okay, you can know all the words all day long. But if they sound horrible and screeching and the people are doing this, they're not listening, right? The words that I've given you to hear is so important. And I love this. And so here, the word foundation is very, very key, because he said it is one who is built upon the rock. The foundation was built on the rock. And so that word foundation here is key. Why? Because what something sits on absolutely matters. And the way that this applies to life, the way that we can marry these two things together, there are levels that we don't always consider. All right, we don't really always give that the strength that it needs to have to look at that. So it goes back to not just quoting what he said, but living out what he said. Now, what I speak of here, I'm not talking about being perfect, because none of us in this room are going to be. None of us that may hear this at any other time are going to be. That's not about that. We're not talking about being without flaw. We're not talking about being pious or snooty in some kind of way, like I've arrived. I heard a minister this past week. He put out a video that I would not have let come out, okay, because I wouldn't have said what he said. But he told his congregation, I have finally arrived. Well, that's a dangerous statement. He said, because I am holy and I am flawless, and you need to be more like me. I would never tell you that, because my wife wouldn't let you. But I would never tell you that, because I'm not there anywhere close, right? But that's not what Jesus is talking about. He didn't say nobody. That's what he's talking about. No, it's about be a better example. Show people there's a better way. There is light. There is hope. They are real. How do we do that? Act on these words of mine. Love one another. Show each other that it matters. Show each other that in our brokenness, come beside one another and say, hey, we can do this together. Two are always better than one. Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes, 3 chords are better than one. I mean, it's over there. And they say if you know 3 chords, you can play any song that there is. Is that right, Scott? But here, we see it's important what he's talking about, building on stuff. Act on these words of mine. So the wisdom here, it points out hearing and applying. That's how those two things work together. Knowledge, and this is a total, you won't find this anywhere else. This is a total Pastor Andy illustration. Knowledge is holding the fork. Wisdom is using it to enjoy the meal. So if you want to look at it from the most simplistic terms ever, that's it, right? What do I do with this? If we put it to use, it changes things, right? It makes things better. So here he uses the illustration of a house on the rock, and he gives that in a very clear image. In other words, life. These words, when they get applied to it, when it falls apart, and there are times, my friends, and again, it's not to be negative, it is not to be anything else. When it falls apart, and it's going to happen. What he's saying here is if we understand these words of mine and act upon them, when life falls apart, you can keep standing. You can keep standing. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be pretty. There still might be some banged up stuff, and we all carry a lot of scars. But it will be able to be rebuilt because of what has held it up. All right? So if there's a solid structure there may be some stuff missing, but we can put it back together. We can rebuild because of what's been left. Because if it's all gone, if it's all annihilated and there's nothing left, you can't rebuild that, right? It's like when a house is burned down and there's nothing left. There ain't a stud nor a rafters. It's all gone. But if there's a concrete pad there, they can put a new one up. That foundation mattered. All right? This is where he's trying to get us to go and see. So he continues. So that's just the first half. And you're like, well, man, I've read this passage. I've heard the rock on the house and the sand 1,000,000 times. Well, I never thought about we could take 30 minutes and actually talk about it. And we've only gotten halfway. But we got just a few more minutes as we look at the second half. And he says, but. And in this particular case, but always changes the conversation. But in this case, it points to the alternative. So we've got the wise one that has built their house on the rock. He says, but everyone. Now, why is that important that we see that mentioned again? Because it's the same audience. It's all inclusive. All right, this is not changed from one place to another. This is like every crowd, everybody who listens and everybody who don't, the same words still apply. So that's important. He said, so there's a regardless moment here. He said, everyone who hears these words of mine and doesn't act on them. So these words are the same to everybody. They haven't changed. It's not like this applies to you and this applies to you. No, they're all the same. He said, everybody who hears these words and do not act upon them. So it's the same thing. Again, this points to life application versus group association. All right? Well, everybody got told the same thing, but everybody don't respond in the same way. Everybody don't act in the same way. What is he saying here? How we live matters. How we apply things matters. Everyone who hears and does not. It's like this illustration, friends. A red light means stop. That applies to every single person. No exemptions. That applies to all, regardless of who we are. Does everybody stop? Not around here, but just go out and drive for a few minutes, you'll find out. But it still applies. Everybody who hears avoids the accident and the ticket. Everybody who doesn't, well, he said, everybody who hears these words of mine and does not act upon them. Love your neighbor, don't hate, forgive, don't worry, ask questions, seek answers. This applies to everybody. There's no exemptions here. There's none. One who does not build on something that is not just durable, but something that will withstand the storms that come. He said, one who does not build on that, well, they don't just fall apart, he says. They collapse. I mean, it goes into oblivion. It's nothing. He says, but one who does, it finds the ability to start again. And one who does not finds the ability to start again almost impossible because everything's gone. Why? Because I didn't have anything to start with. I wasn't building on anything to start with. And he says, one such as that is foolish because they built their house on the sand. In other words, you heard the very same words as everybody else, but you said no. You said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it my way. I'm not listening to that. I'm going to do whatever I want. And here we see that both houses, this is so important that we look at this illustration and understand this. You can say yes, you can say no. The unifying factor in the concept, in the story, in the illustration is the fact that both sides heard the same words. Both sides hear the same words. So both houses, not only do they hear the same words, but look at what they also get. Both houses get rain. Both houses get the river rising. Both have the wind blowing. But that's not punishment. That's life. Because the one who heard it and built on the rock and the one who heard it and built on the sand, they heard the same thing. They both got the same rain. They both got the same wind. They got it all. It's all the same. That's not punishment. That's life. Everybody gets a taste. Nobody's exempt. Even the guy that thinks he's holy and he's made it. He'll find out. Okay? That's what it is. That's the reality. I mean, I've walked in this particular role in this life for almost 26 years. And I can promise you I am as far from exempt as anybody could get. And the last year has proven that in abundance, all right? We're all in this together, all right? And so here we're seeing that in that light, knowing that both houses get the wind, both houses get the rain, both houses heard the same thing, nobody can cry unfair. Nobody, because it's there. Everybody gets a little bit. But look at the results of why the foundation matters. He says the one on the rock, again, that applied these words of mine, it withstood and it remained. It hung on. But the one who built on the sand, in the same situation, you heard, but the one in the sand, well, it tells us it fell and it collapsed with a great crash. What was the difference? It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the weather. They both heard the same thing. The difference was the foundation. The difference was the foundation. And it all goes back to understanding the lessons of his words. The lessons of his words, not just being able to repeat them. So we can repeat a whole lot of things. You can memorize, E equals MC squared. Go figure that out and let me see you do the math. I can't. I wouldn't know where to start. I could write down the equation on a board and look all smart. But then they said, well, how does that work, teacher? Then we'd be in trouble. This is not about just hearing the words. This is upon acting upon the words. What we find is life, and I think this is important, and I don't say write a lot of notes, but this is important. What we find is life doesn't reveal our faith. Life does not reveal our faith. Life reveals its foundation. And when we understand what is something built on, what is something built on? Is it real or is it shaky? And I've been in both. My dad was a builder forever, and we'd go in places that they would want repaired, and you could tell whether the foundation was any good as soon as you walked in, because you could sometimes feel it move. You know, there was one time, and I'll never forget this. It was cold, and this lady had asked for my dad to come in and fix her floor in her kitchen. All right, because it had some soft spots in it. Soft spots being the key word. So we get there, and it's cold outside. All right, and I remember trying to get the materials back and forth, and Dad said, we got to cut this section out, because when you walked across, you kind of did you was like he was walking on the ocean. I mean, it was like this all over the place, right? And so he said, well, we got to cut this piece out so we can see what's under here. So we started working, and my job at that time, this was linoleum floor. Were you familiar with that, right? So my job was to start taking up the layer, singular, of linoleum. Well, we got one up, and then there was two, and then there was three, and then before long there were 27. Okay, 27 layers of linoleum. That was the floor. There was no floor joist under it because they were all rotten. The foundation was gone. We had to rebuild another one. What we find in this lesson is he's teaching us what we build on matters as to whether it will last. And then we read that he gives this powerful lesson, this illustration. And then we read in verse 28, when he finished, and we can imagine the crowd sitting there going, man, this is like awesome. What is he talking? This is incredible. And this attentive crowd, it tells us that he captured them not with his style or some over-the-top character, but with a personal challenge. What'd you build your life on? He wasn't dooming anybody. He wasn't damning anybody. He wasn't screaming at anybody or finger pointing. No, these are mere moment reflections. Like, what are you doing? How are things? What is your foundation? Friends, that same thing still applies right now. It hasn't changed. Every one of us has to answer that question. When we read here that he was done, and the crowds, it tells us, were astonished at his teaching. They had never heard anything like this, because all they'd been hearing was the rules. You do this and you do that and you better and you better. They weren't hearing anything about how do I make me better. I know what to do to keep you off my back, and I know what to do to keep you from telling me I'm wrong, but how do I make me better? I think that question is more important right now than maybe it's ever been, at least in our history. How do I make me better? Because that's a really, really important question. Because I can follow all the rules just like everybody else. Everybody can follow all the rules. But does that make you better? No, that makes you compliant. That's different. All right? I need to know how to make me better. How do I fix me so I can make a better world around me? We read he was done and the crowds were astonished. There are two important words here. Astonished, because that means stunned. It means amazed, not angry, not offended, not how dare you talk to us that way, or how dare you. No, but wow, I got a lot to think about. I can walk away from this and say, man, do I know the words that he's speaking of? Do I know these words of mine? And again, not just practical scriptural memorization, but do I understand the concept of forgiveness and loving one another and hatred? I mean, do I understand all that stuff? I got a lot to think about. And then we see the word teaching. And to me, that word jumps off the page, because this was not giving a speech. This was not demanding an obedience. This was teaching. Teaching. That's a very important word, because that points to the one who cares. That points to one who cares, not just about the material being given, but that it actually helps the listener. That's what he's trying to get us to see here. I'm trying to give you something that will make your life better. I'm trying to give you something that will help you in principle, in logic, and everything. And the teacher cares whether they get it or they don't. Every illustration that Jesus gives is about life application and whether we can use it or not. The difference between informational giver and a teacher is completely two different things. All right? Because there's a lot of people that can give you a whole lot of stuff, but you don't take anything from it because they didn't teach it. They shared it. And that's two different things. And so we read here, they viewed him as one that had authority. One that had authority, but not like the scribes. What were they talking about? What do we see here? Jesus said, these words of mine. Why does that matter? He owned what he gave. I said it. I said it. He's not saying somebody else said it or somebody else wrote. He says, I say it. So he wasn't quoting just simply from someone else. He wasn't hiding behind a tradition or a group of rules. No, he said, I said it. I taught it. I gave it to you. I gave you this. I gave you that. And he's grabbing those that are listening to try to hear these words. I believe that can still happen now if we understand the principles of what we're standing on. It's so much more, friends, than just belief. We can believe in anything. Okay? I mean, we do. We stamp that label on so much stuff now. I believe in, just fill in the blank. And that even includes faith matters sometimes. We just throw this stuff in there. But that wasn't what he was talking about. That wasn't the point at all. He wasn't asking about belief, but rather he was asking, do you understand what I'm saying? You know? Do you understand what I'm teaching? Do you understand these words of mine? Do you grasp it? Do you understand this teaching? Because I'm not teaching you to build a house. I'm teaching you how to build a life that gives back, a life that shares, a life that provides examples of everything that I've taught. And I'm asking you, are you doing that and showing others that it is possible? Can you see that? Because that was, as Peter would write about Jesus, our greatest example. Not because of the life that he lived and died and all those other things that we certainly appreciate and worship and adorn, but the life that was lived out. That says, this can be done. We can actually do this. And what he's saying here is, where does these words of mine point you? Which direction does that send you? Not which passage do you know, not which one have you memorized, but which one do you actually live out? That's a challenge. I mean, it really, really is. That's a challenge. And so this lesson, again, was not about architecture. Buildings are not tested in the sunshine. Buildings are not tested in windless days. The strength of a foundation is found during the storm. That's when we find out what's really there. That's when we find out, will it hold up? Will it last? So ask yourself today, as I did when I was writing these notes, what am I building my life on? What am I building my life on? Is it rock or sand? Which one is it? I mean, that's the challenge here. And it is my hope, as I always say, as you read this, hopefully again, one day, today, anytime, whenever, when you read this and you begin, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, you stop right there. You just stop right there and you give that some deeper thought. What are those words? Because faith is recognizable not because of what it argues, but how it's lived out. That's when it gets real. Lord, we thank you for the opportunity to share and pray that these words matter as we think about foundation, as we think about the challenge that is there, that is important, that we look at what that means, and that we can take a simple illustration that has been given for hundreds and hundreds of times all across different accounts and platforms such as this and sermons and books and whatever the case, but that we get the lesson of actually that illustration and the fact of talking about life and how we live it and how that matters. So I just pray, Lord, that it would just apply to all of us today, that we understand the simple, basic principles of that. And we just pray now, Lord, that you would just minister through this final song and our time together. And we just pray in advance right now before we wrap our time up, that you would just bless the time of fellowship that we have after this as we celebrate Stanley and his family. And we just thank you for that. And we ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.